right, everybody. The Callisto Protocol is a survival horror game directed by Glenn Schofield, the chief game director, along with Michael Condrey of the original Dead Space and Dead Space 2. He worked on that, but he left before that game was finished. Callisto Protocol is the first game from his new studio called Striking Distance Studios. If you're not familiar with Glenn Schofield, he left EA Redwood Shores / Visceral Games, and then he worked for Sledgehammer Games for Activision on Call of Duty. Then he left that studio as well, and then he formed Striking Distance Studios. It has a few alumni from Visceral Games, but it's a pretty small studio. So Callisto Protocol has been highly advertised, and it's been hyped for quite a while. It's also been said, supposedly, that the setting of this game is more of what the original Dead Space was originally intended to be. I don't believe that, because I'm pretty sure that the original Dead Space was really meant to be like a System Shock 3. The same thing has been said about BioShock, but who knows? Originally, this game was said to take place in the PUBG universe, and that didn't sound very good to a lot of people, myself included. And it's easy to forget that Krafton, the publisher of Callisto Protocol, is in fact the publisher and owner of the PUBG IP. So that would make sense. They backtracked on that decision, so it no longer has anything to do with PUBG that we're aware of. They could always change their mind in the future. Between that and the fame from Glenn Schofield and the expectations based on Dead Space, and the fact that allegedly a lot of Sony employees worked on this game, it generated a lot of hype. Now that it's finally out, let's get into it. Callisto Protocol doesn't have a bad story, but it definitely leaves something to be desired. The game pretty much leaves it up to you to assume what's happening based on your familiarity with horror tropes and sci-fi tropes. And because of that, the game is very predictable from the start. Similar to BioShock or System Shock, you also have a friend in the background guiding you throughout the game who passes you information through a radio. However, in this game, he is actually a real person who is who he says he is. You meet him in person the first time, unlike System Shock 2 or BioShock, where the person you thought was on your side actually turns out to be either the antagonist or one of the antagonists. That's not the case here. The characters that you communicate with throughout the game do actually exist and show up in person from time to time. It's not a story that any sci-fi horror fans haven't heard of over and over, although it does use the same storytelling methods as most games that have taken their lineage from System Shock. And that means that, like Resident Evil or System Shock, most of your introduction to the actual plot of the game is going to be through audio logs or text logs, or in Dead Space's case, video logs. Of course, there are cutscenes that show you kind of the forefront of the story, and then all the other documents and collectibles leave it up to you to actually read them or listen to them to get the backstory of what's happening. Of course, again, those cutscenes provide most of the exposition. It doesn't do anything that most games aren't doing, and that's the problem, because it also doesn't do anything that most games aren't doing. Suffice it to say, there isn't a unique storytelling method here. There's nothing special about the narrative structure. It's a functional story. It's interesting. but the plot development really stagnates for the first half of the game, and then all in the last 4 chapters they dump pretty much all of the information on you at once. The climax of the game literally doesn't even happen until the last chapter, and then finally you get to the last boss and there's more exposition, and then that's it. That's the end of the story. On that note, the story does end in a cliffhanger, and not only does it end in a cliffhanger, but the actual plot is pretty much unresolved by the time the credits roll. Even after the credits, because there is I think there's a post-credits scene, or mid-credits. Similar to The Last of Us, the combat in Callisto Protocol focuses heavily on melee encounters with a similar dodging system that requires not only good judgment, but essentially memorizing enemy attack patterns and memorizing the exact time to press the stick in order to dodge or block correctly. If you attack aggressively with melee, you will eventually die. Most enemies have a pattern where they will allow you to hit them twice, and then regardless of what happens, they're going to hit you. And if you don't dodge it, you're going to take more damage than you need to. While the dodging in Last of Us was more stringent on timing, the dodging in this game doesn't really require you to do things at the correct time, as long as you press the right input. You're going to dodge. There is a time factor, but it's almost impossible to do it wrong once you learn how to actually dodge correctly. In fact, it's very similar to the melee combat in the last fight in Uncharted 4. Basically, every melee encounter is the same as that fight, but less frustrating because, again, there is a longer time limit that gives you a lot more leeway. One of the major criticisms, and I believe one of the major reasons that people didn't jive with this game, is the melee system. The fact that the combat is so heavily focused on using the stun baton. So many people have posted calling the combat shit or bad, and it really isn't. It really isn't. Within the first hour or two of the game, it should have been really no challenge to master the dodging system. That doesn't mean you're going to perfectly dodge everything that ever happens, but it really stops being an issue before the game gets moving. Having said that, I wouldn't call the combat good either, and that's the problem. It's functional. At times it's engaging and it makes you think, but it's not, it just kind of feels like it could have had more time in the oven. Once you've seen one fight in the game, you've pretty much seen them all. As I said, almost every fight is exactly the same, where you basically follow a pattern of dodge, dodge, hit, hit, dodge, dodge, hit. Sometimes you can hit them 3 times, maybe even 4 times, if you want to push your luck, but pretty, like, literally every enemy in the game follows the same pattern. That's exaggeration, obviously. There are, of course, multiple enemy types. The spitters don't behave the same way. I don't know what they're actually called. We're going to call them spitters. The Bugs Life dudes that look like crickets or grasshoppers or whatever, they have a different pattern as well. They're basically like lickers, or drain demos from Resident Evil. They crawl around on the ceiling and drop down on you. But the normal infected all follow the same pattern, and those are the majority of the enemies that you fight for probably 2/3 of the game. And then they get replaced by these extremely annoying blind enemies that you can stab in the back. But if you shoot one or you hit one and it doesn't die, then every single enemy in the entire area will bear down on you. And you can survive, probably, but it's not going to be pretty. The only one that's any different is the final boss. The game has 7 weapons similar to Dead Space, although one of them is temporary and will never be used again after a certain point. So there really are only 6 weapons, and you can only upgrade those 6 weapons. The second weapon you get is the stun baton, which is the first real weapon. That can be upgraded at the Reforge. You also get a pistol, a skunk gun, which is kind of a sawed-off shotgun, an actual shotgun. You can make a tactical pistol, and then there's a assault rifle. Most of these weapons have a relatively different function, although they all, except the assault rifle, are close-range weapons. The assault rifle is most useful for taking out some enemies that are ranged, like the ones that spit at you, or the ones that crawl on the ceiling, or even this game's version of the drag tentacle, which is just an enemy that will grab you from the darkness before you can shoot it and pull you towards it. But it gives you an option to mash a button, and that way you can escape. Another one of the major differences here between Dead Space and Callisto Protocol is that the guns have alternate fire modes, but unlike the alternate fire modes in Dead Space, most of which involved being able to set traps or crowd control enemies, all the alternate fire modes in Callisto Protocol are basically direct attacks. So the only thing they do is increase the amount of shots that your gun fires, or the amount of damage that it does. One of them is a heat-seeking bullet, so you can technically fire indirectly, but it still accomplishes the same thing, versus Dead Space, where you could lay down trip mines or gravity wells, or even use a grenade launcher. There doesn't really seem to be any crowd control mechanic in this game. That said, there doesn't appear to be a need for one either, because if you engage a group of enemies that is more than one enemy, the second and the third and the fourth enemy, or however many, will just sit there, and they won't actually try to attack you until you kill the first one or you're out of an animation. So if you're frame locked into an animation that's already playing, then the other enemies will just sit there. At worst, if you happen to be fighting a spitter, then it will spit acid at you from across the level while you're actually fighting the other enemy. But that's the only scenario where more than one enemy will actually attack you at once. As to be expected, again, like most games in this genre, you have healing items. You can either loot or print a medical injector, which is a health pack, or you can pick up health items in the world off of enemies or in cabinets or in chests or whatever. The game has a diegetic HUD just like Dead Space, so you can see your health meter and your kinesis meter, and you'll see them refill when you use health items. Unlike Dead Space, this game does not have stasis, but it does have kinesis. It's called something different. It's the GRP or something. Doesn't matter what it stands for. It's kinesis. You can use, unlike Dead Space as well, you can use kinesis or GRP to actually pick enemies up and throw them off of the map. You can, of course, throw objects at them, like exploding canisters or just whatever crap you find lying around. You can also pick the entire enemy up, or you can even throw them at these spike walls that are placed everywhere in the game. Other than that, the kinesis has no real purpose. It also does the same thing as it would do in Dead Space or Bioshock or System Shock, where you can pick up items across the level. Usually they're in places that you couldn't get to without the kinesis. As many people probably expected, being from the same game director, Callisto has a somewhat similar crafting system / upgrade system to Dead Space. However, it's closer to Dead Space 1 than it is to Dead Space 3, but it's really not too similar to either one. So each of the weapons has a predefined upgrade track that only has so many different, like, quote unquote nodes, like you would see on the upgrade system for Dead Space. And you can choose which one to upgrade at which time. And of course, just like Dead Space, they're tied together. So if you don't have the node connecting, or rather, whatever you want to call them, if you don't have the node that links to the node that you want, you can't activate that one. So you have to actually follow the track, like the sphere grid in FF10. You have to actually activate the node that's adjacent before you can do it. So you can't just jump around and obviously jump straight to the top tier upgrade for any of the weapons. However, the problem with Callisto Protocol is, compared to Dead Space, they give you literally nothing as far as credits go. In Dead Space, you would pick up credits non-stop, and each item would be like 400 credits, or even at the worst, it would be 100 credits. Sometimes towards the ends of the game, it would be 2,000 credits or more in one item. And then, of course, also you could stomp enemies and get credits. Callisto Protocol, of course, does the same thing, except when you pick up credits, it's like 3 credits or 5 credits or 21 credits. There is no point in the game ever at which you will pick up more than 100 credits at once. And unlike Dead Space, every single enemy you kill also doesn't guarantee that it's going to drop something when you stomp it. So you have to go around stomping everyone. And then furthermore, some of the enemies in Dead Space would drop items when you shoot them. That won't ever happen in Callisto Protocol, so you 100% have to stomp the enemies for any chance at an item, and it's usually not going to be anything worth crap if they do drop one. So it's odd, because the game didn't ship with a New Game Plus, yet it's literally impossible to activate every upgrade for every gun in one playthrough. As far as art design goes, graphically, this is easily one of the most beautiful games I've ever played. The particle effects, like the sparks, are incredible. The volumetric lighting, the volumetric effects like the smoke or the fog or even the snow or like the toxins. The fire does weirdly kind of look two-dimensional the more you look at it. It's probably the most out of place thing in the game graphically, because it does look weird when you look at it too long. But fortunately, there isn't a lot of fire in the game, so it's really only in the first few chapters. Outside of the moon or down into some of the later areas, or it's hard to tell because of some performance issues, but everything really does look just incredible. I unfortunately didn't get to experience the game at 4K or even ultra graphic settings because my computer can't handle it. I haven't played it on console, so I don't know if it would look better. I probably, but it's clear that it looks excellent regardless. The setting is really cool as well, and it's disappointing that you spend so little time out on the surface of the moon. Like 80% of the game, at least, more than that, 90% of the game is spent inside of buildings with no view of the stars or the sky or anything else. It's just like 90% buildings. more than 90%, really. The aesthetic reminds me of a lot of other sci-fi stuff, like the suits kind of remind me of the environmental suits in Stargate Universe to some extent. The 3D printing looks pretty cool. This animation in particular, I like it. I thought it's funny because the upgrades for the GRP glove are literally just microprocessors. So the Reforge just prints a processor and then he just sticks it in like under the surface of the glove, and then it upgrades it. The animations are all very smooth. This is what Sony worked on the game, supposedly, the motion capture. So not only the motion capture, but like the lip syncing for the voice actors looks great. Nothing short of excellent, just like you would expect from a lot of other AAA games like Last of Us or Uncharted or Ghost of Tsushima or whatever, God of War. All these games have incredible motion capture, and this isn't an exception. Another reason I think this game didn't do as well as expected is because Dead Space came out 15 years ago, and this game uses a lot of the same tricks that the original Dead Space did. And when I say that, I'm talking about things like intentional lighting or sound effects that don't actually have anything to do with the gameplay, and they are just put there to scare you on purpose, like jump scares or extremely loud noises or something that don't turn out to be anything. And it's kind of played out. It didn't work as well in the Dead Space remake either, so it's not to this game's discredit. Other than that, I don't really want to talk about the sound design. I think Josh Duhamel and Karen Nakamura, or whatever her name is, and Sam Witwer all did a fantastic job. I don't remember the guy's name who played Cole. He did a good job as well. I don't think any of them did like outstanding voice actor work, but they didn't do a bad job. I mean, they all did what they were paid to do, and they did it well. When I first saw this mentioned, it was on Twitter, and I dismissed it on account of Twitter primarily being, sensationalist nonsense 99.99% of the time. So I figured, yeah, there's probably quite a bit of shimmying and crawling in vents, but people are blowing it out of proportion. No, that's not the case. You literally crawl through a vent or shimmy along a ledge or squeeze between walls or something at least 150 times in this game. And keep in mind, the game is only 8 chapters long. The first playthrough is probably going to last you like 12 hours, if that, depending on how well you master the game mechanics and what difficulty you play on. And if you're the type of person that explores things or just keeps moving forward, it is actually ridiculous how many of these sequences there are. And it literally starts in the first chapter. Shimmy parts. That's one of the major issues with this game, is that it throws in so much of this standard game design AAA template bullshit that does not really need to be in games anymore. And I can't name a single reason why it does this. It's like they looked at other games and they're like, hey, other AAA games do this. We should do this too. And it doesn't need to be done. There are so many games that do this. And yeah, it fits, but you don't need to repeat these sequences ad nauseum. So I mean, you have these shimmy sequences in literally every AAA game that's come out for like decades. If the shimmy sequences weren't bad enough, the game starts within the first 5 minutes with this horrible climbing sequence in this video you see. This is the only time you ever have to do this in the game, fortunately. It's not even like it's the COD ice climbing section that somehow made its way into Resident Evil 6 more than once. There's no interactivity to this climbing section. You literally just hold the control stick in the right direction and wait for it to move, because it takes like 15 seconds for him to actually do anything, which again makes sense if the ship is being depressurized, but still, it's just dumb. It shouldn't even be a thing. And then of course you have this awful water slide. I thought it was going to be longer. Fortunately, it wasn't. So you have this bad water slide section, which has also been in countless games. In addition to basically being a Battletoads speeder bike level, it's like the ending of Resident Evil 4 if you couldn't see what you were doing and you had a time limit. Regardless, we need to find new things to do in video games instead of repeating these sequences. These big set pieces that everyone's tired of. I have to say, I actually did like the water slide level the second time I played the game, because I knew what to expect. The first time I played it, I literally alt-tabbed and was trying to understand what I was doing wrong. And while I wasn't even playing the game, that's when I was able to get through the fans without getting killed. So, whatever. But the whole set piece itself was actually pretty cool. I just wish it had been something different, I guess. Like, it was cool, but it wasn't so cool that I would have requested it. After launch day, the only major issue I ever encountered in the game is a massive level of detail problem. The level of detail in the textures and the geometry will drop to absolutely non-existent. And then eventually at some point, it'll jump back up. And I never really determined what the issue was. I assume it's being out of VRAM or something, but it happens constantly throughout the game. The only time I didn't encounter that problem was towards the very beginning of the game, the first 2 chapters. As soon as you start to get deeper and deeper into the game, it just nosedives, and there's a constant LOD issue. In all seriousness, the worst part of this game, besides the technical issues, are that they tried so much to do so many different things and focus more on some of those things than the others. It's nowhere near as bad as something like Resident Evil 6. Fortunately, it's not that much of a train wreck. If you aren't familiar with Resident Evil 6, it's one of the most discombobulated, unorganized, everything but the kitchen sink excuses for a game literally ever made in 50 years of gaming. Some of it is good, some of it is fun. Most of it is just absolutely god-awful in every imaginable way. So, Callisto Protocol isn't nearly that bad, but for me, the absolute worst part of the game is that 2 entire chapters focus around this basic level stealth gameplay that doesn't really need to be in a game that started out the first 5 chapters playing like Dead Space and ends playing like Dead Space. Dead Space doesn't have any stealth sections. None of the games do. To me, there's no valid reason for there to be a stealth section in this game. It fits with the story and it fits with the lore, of course, but it just didn't need to happen. And if it did need to happen, they should have balanced it out by adding in 2 more chapters of better gameplay, because this is all you do for these 2 chapters. You sneak around, you stab blind enemies in the face, and there may be like 10 enemies, 10 to 15 enemies total that you don't have to stab because they're normal enemies. But this is the majority of chapter 6 and 7. You just sneak around because if you make noise or too much noise, all these enemies will come after you at once. All right, so let's wrap this up. Callisto Protocol is an example of what we see far too often with AAA gaming, is that games take years and years to produce. They get overhyped during the process and they show off probably a bit more information than they should to get people excited. And then when the final product comes out, it turns out everything they showed was basically the entire game. Like so many AAA games, this one is short, rather safe. It doesn't push the envelope in any way, really, and doesn't offer really anything that anyone hasn't seen before. I don't think it's a bad game at all. I actually enjoyed Callisto Protocol a lot after they fixed the day one issues that made it literally unplayable. I don't have the season pass, and I'm not sure what it's going to include if it hasn't already finished. But I thought it was a pretty decent game. Like I said previously, there is a cliffhanger. So I'm curious what's going to happen with the story, if there will be a sequel. Because just like the original Dead Space, EA had unrealistic expectations. And about a month ago, not even a month ago, the beginning of February, Krafton already said that they were disappointed with the sales performance. And that's just stupid. Like, it's hilarious that a different publisher would make the same mistake potentially with another IP that EA made with Dead Space, but we'll see. I'm not sure what the price is of the game right now. I would still say it's worth buying. It's worth at least 2 or 3 playthroughs. But you're not going to get like 100 hours out of this game for sure, even with the season pass. So it has a good, if not contrite story. Excellent graphics, great sound design, mildly boring gameplay at times. Especially once you're in New Game Plus, it's a joke. Like, it's impossible to die unless you just don't attack. And the game length overall is pretty short. But if you're interested in sci-fi horror, if you are a fan of Dead Space, I would give it a try, maybe when it's cheaper if you don't want to pay that much money for it. But I think it's a pretty decent game. But no, I'm not saying by any means that it's exceptional game like Dead Space Remake was, but it is still a good game. So that's all for now, folks. Take it easy.